The question caught me off guard, even though I'd been preparing for it all morning. "Mr. Briggs," said the man on the other end of the line, his voice measured and professional, "I understand your daughter's husband is Craig Holloway. The Craig Holloway of Holloway Property Development?" I shifted in the hospital bed, wincing as the IV line pulled against the back of my hand. "That's correct. He doesn't know I'm having this conversation. Neither does she." A pause. "And you're comfortable moving forward under those circumstances?" "More comfortable than I've been about anything in a long time," I said. Outside my window, the Savannah skyline sat pale and quiet in the early November morning. I'd lived in this city for 41 years, raised my daughter here, buried my wife here, spent 32 years as principal of Hartwell High School, walking those hallways until I knew every crack in every tile. Now, I was lying in Memorial University Medical Center with a mild stroke on my chart and a plan forming in my mind that my daughter never saw coming. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 66 years old. And what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my only child tried to use my illness to take everything I'd spent a lifetime building, and how I made sure she understood, in the clearest possible terms, that she'd badly miscalculated. The stroke happened on a Tuesday. I'd been in my wood shop behind the house on Abercorn Street, working on a rocking chair I'd been building for 8 months. Nothing fancy, just Georgia pine and patience. The kind of project that keeps a retired man honest. I remember setting down my chisel, feeling a strange heaviness in my right arm, and then the room tilted sideways in a way rooms aren't supposed to tilt. I sat down on the shop floor, which was the smartest thing I'd done all week, and called 911 before I called Amanda. The doctors called it a transient ischemic attack, a warning stroke. No permanent damage, full recovery expected, but they wanted to monitor me for several days. I was 66, alone since my wife Carol passed 4 years ago, and my only nearby family was Amanda, who lived 20 minutes away in a new construction house in Pooler, with her husband Craig and their 2 Labrador retrievers. She arrived at the hospital 90 minutes after I called her. I know because I watched the clock. She stayed for 45 minutes. For the first 20, she was the daughter I remembered. Worried eyes, hand over her mouth when the doctor explained what had happened, squeezing my fingers too tight. That was the Amanda who used to bring me coffee in my school office on the first day of every semester, just to see how the new year felt. Then Craig arrived. He walked in, still wearing his business clothes, a real estate development company, polo and pressed khakis, his phone already in his hand. He kissed Amanda on the cheek, nodded at me in the bed the way you nod at a car that's broken down on the side of the road, and said, "How bad is it?" Not "How are you, Dad?" Not "I'm glad you're okay." "How bad is it?" I told him what the doctors had told me. He nodded, tapping something into his phone while I spoke. When I finished, he looked up and said, very quietly, so only I could hear, "We're going to need to start thinking seriously about your living situation, Walter." I said nothing. I watched him. A man your age, living alone in that big house, this was bound to happen. You need supervision. Assisted living, maybe, or... He smiled the smile of a man who has already done the math. We could help you transition somewhere more manageable and liquidate the Abercorn property. Free up some capital while it's still a seller's market. The house on Abercorn Street had been appraised the previous spring at $720,000. I knew that because I'd had it appraised myself, for reasons I'll explain shortly. Craig knew it too, because I'd made the mistake of mentioning it at Thanksgiving 2 years prior. Amanda spent the last 10 minutes of her visit on her phone near the window. As they were leaving, she touched my arm and said she'd check in tomorrow. Craig said, "Rest up," with the energy of a man crossing an item off a list. The door closed. The room was quiet. I lay there looking at the ceiling for a long time. The next morning, a social worker named Patricia came by to discuss my discharge plan. She was young and earnest and took detailed notes, and she became, without knowing it, my first ally. When she asked if I had family support at home, I told her the truth. My daughter lived nearby, but had not called since her visit. Patricia's pen stopped moving. She looked up at me with careful, professional neutrality that didn't quite hide what she was feeling. "Not once?" she said. "Not once," I said. She wrote something down. I decided I liked Patricia. I made 3 phone calls that day. The first was to my attorney. a man named Douglas Whitfield who had drafted my will 7 years earlier and handled Carol's estate after she passed. I told him what had happened with the stroke, what Craig had said, and what I wanted to do. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about Douglas. When I finished, he said, "I'll need you to sign some documents before you're discharged. I can come to the hospital tomorrow morning." The second call was to a private investigator named Roy Cates, whose name I'd gotten from Douglas some weeks earlier for reasons I'll come to. I'd actually made first contact with Roy 3 weeks before the stroke, when I'd started noticing certain things about Craig's behavior that didn't sit right with a man who'd spent 32 years reading people for a living. Principals get very good at knowing when someone is running a scheme. Roy's preliminary work had already turned up enough to concern me. Now I asked him to run the full investigation. The third call was to my neighbor of 18 years, a retired pharmacist named George Alderman, who had a key to my house and the good sense not to ask too many questions. I asked him to go to the wood shop and make sure the rocking chair was covered with a tarp. It sounds like a strange priority for a man in a hospital bed, but that chair meant something to me, and I wasn't ready to explain why yet. Amanda came the following afternoon, alone this time. She sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed and asked how I was feeling, and I said fine, getting better, and we talked around the edges of things the way families do when something large and unsaid is sitting in the center of the room. She mentioned twice that Craig had done some research on senior living communities in Chatham County. She mentioned once that the real estate market was still really strong, Dad. She did not mention that she had not called in 36 hours while her father lay in a hospital bed following a stroke. I didn't bring it up either. I had learned, in 32 years of handling difficult conversations with parents and teachers and school board members, that timing is everything. You don't show your cards until you have the full hand. Roy Cates emailed me his preliminary findings that evening. I read them on the tablet George had brought from my house, the screen brightness turned down low in the dark hospital room. The first page was bad enough. Holloway Property Development had 3 active civil judgments against it, totaling just over $200,000. 2 were from subcontractors Craig hadn't paid. One was from a private lender who claimed Craig had misrepresented the value of a parcel in Effingham County to secure a development loan. The company's operating account, which Roy had traced through public business filings, showed a balance that should have scared any reasonable person. The second page was worse. Roy had obtained through channels he described only as available public records and cooperative sources, a chain of emails between Craig and a commercial lending firm in Atlanta. Craig had been in discussions for 6 months about a bridge loan to cover the Effingham situation. The collateral he'd proposed, described in the email chain as a residential property in historic Savannah District, clear title, estimated value $700K plus, matched the description of my house on Abercorn Street to the letter. He'd been planning to use my house as loan collateral, a house he didn't own, a house whose owner he was simultaneously pressuring to sell. I set the tablet down on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The full report arrived 2 days later, and Roy had not understated it when he said I'd want to be sitting down. The email trail went back 14 months. Craig had first floated the idea of helping Walter transition to senior living to Amanda in a text message. Roy had obtained this through the civil discovery process connected to one of the subcontractor lawsuits, where Craig's phone records had been subpoenaed. Amanda's response had been a single word that I won't repeat here, but it was not a refusal. It was an acknowledgement. There was more. Craig had spoken with 2 different real estate attorneys about the process of obtaining power of attorney over an elderly parent's finances. One of them had apparently advised him that a documented medical event, such as a stroke, would significantly strengthen such a petition if the parent could be characterized as unable to manage their own affairs. My stroke had not been an accident of timing for Craig. It had been an opportunity. I finished reading the report at 11 o'clock at night, 3 days after my admission. The hospital was quiet. Down the hall, machines beeped softly. I thought about Carol, who had died believing our daughter was the kind of person we'd raised her to be. I thought about 32 years of high school graduations, where I'd shaken hundreds of young hands and told hundreds of young people that integrity was the only currency that compounded over time. Then I picked up the phone and called Douglas Whitfield. "How fast can you have the new documents ready?" I asked. "They're already drafted," he said. "I'll be there at 8. Douglas arrived the next morning with a briefcase and a notary. We spent 2 hours at the small table in my hospital room. The new will was simple and thorough. My estate, including the house on Abercorn Street, my retirement accounts, and a brokerage portfolio Carol and I had built over decades, would pass entirely to the Savannah Community Foundation's Education Endowment, a fund that provided college scholarships to first-generation students from Chatham County Public Schools. The kind of students I'd spent my career believing in. Amanda's name did not appear anywhere in the new documents. The living trust made the will effectively uncontestable. Douglas had structured it with the precision of a man who had seen families destroy themselves over inheritances before and had no interest in watching it happen again. "If Craig tries to challenge this," he said, capping his pen, "he'll spend more in legal fees than any challenge could possibly recover. And he'll lose." There was one more item. I signed a limited power of attorney not to Amanda or Craig, but to Douglas and George Alderman jointly, covering only medical decisions in the event I was genuinely incapacitated. Clean, narrow, and entirely outside Craig's reach. Douglas packed up his briefcase. Before he left, he set a plain white envelope on my bedside table. "Roy says to give you this," he said. "He thought you might want it for a particular conversation." Inside was a single printed page. A screenshot of the email chain between Craig and the Atlanta lending firm, with my home address highlighted in yellow. I put it back in the envelope. I thought about who should deliver it, and when, and how. That was when I thought of Patricia. She came by on her afternoon rounds, clipboard in hand, the same careful professionalism she'd shown from the start. I asked her to sit down, which she did, with the slightly cautious look of a social worker who has learned to be ready for anything. "My son-in-law is going to come here," I said. "Probably in the next day or two, once he figures out that things aren't moving on the house the way he planned. He may ask about my condition, my discharge timeline, my mental capacity. He may use words like next steps or transition planning." Patricia's pen was very still. "When he does," I said, "I'd like you to give him this." I held out the white envelope. "And then I'd like you to hand him this card." I placed Douglas Whitfield's business card on top. The card has a note on the back. It says, "Tuesday at 10 a.m. Douglas Whitfield's office. Don't be late." Patricia looked at the envelope. She looked at the card. She looked at me. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Briggs?" "I spent 32 years as a high school principal," I said. "I'm very sure." The corner of her mouth moved. "I'll be at the desk," she said. I was discharged the following morning. My speech was fully clear. My right side had recovered entirely, and the neurologist wanted me back in 6 weeks for a follow-up, but was pleased with my progress. George picked me up and drove me home, and when I walked into the house on Abercorn Street for the first time in a week, I stood in the front hallway for a moment and just breathed it in. Hardwood floors Carol had picked out, a hallway table I'd refinished the summer we moved in. 30 years of a life lived honestly, right here in these rooms. Craig wanted to liquidate this into a bridge loan for a bad development deal in Effingham County. I went out to the wood shop. The tarp was exactly where I'd asked George to put it. I lifted one corner and looked at the rocking chair, 8 months of evenings and weekends. The joints fitted by hand, the seat shaped with a spoke shave until it matched the curve I'd sketched on a paper bag when the idea first came to me. Still unfinished. Still waiting. I covered it back up and went inside to rest. Roy called that evening with his surveillance update. Craig had visited the hospital that afternoon, approximately 3 hours after my discharge. Patricia had given him the envelope. "He stood at the nurse's station for about 2 minutes without moving," Roy said. He paused. "She said he read it 3 times. How did he look?" "Like a man who just realized the building he bought has no foundation," Roy said. I thanked him and hung up. Through the front window, I could see the November light going orange over the oak trees on Abercorn Street. Somewhere across town, Craig was showing that email to Amanda. They were having a conversation I had no interest in imagining too carefully. Let them have the weekend. Let them try to find an angle that wasn't there. Tuesday came in cold and clear. I wore my good suit, the charcoal one I'd worn to every graduation ceremony for the last decade, and a tie Carol had given me on our 30th anniversary. My right hand was still slightly unsteady from the stroke, so I'd practiced tying the knot twice before I was satisfied. Some things are worth the extra effort. Douglas's office was on Bull Street, 3 blocks from Forsyth Park, I arrived at 9:40 and had coffee with his assistant while we waited. At 8 minutes past 10, Amanda and Craig walked in together. Amanda saw me first. The color left her face in a single, visible wave. She'd clearly been hoping right up until this moment that there was still some version of events where this meeting was something other than what it was. Craig kept his face neutral. He was good at that. I'd give him that much. He had the controlled expression of a man who sells things for a living, who has learned to project confidence the way other people project heat. He looked at Douglas, at me, at the leather chairs arranged in a precise semicircle, and I watched him calculating. There was nothing left to calculate. But he didn't know that yet. Douglas was at his best in this room. 30 years of estate law had given him the unhurried authority of a man who has seen every version of this conversation before and knows exactly how each one ends. He waited until everyone was seated before he spoke. Amanda, Craig, thank you for coming. Mr. Briggs asked me to handle this meeting on his behalf, and I'll do so directly. As you may be aware, following his recent hospitalization, Walter undertook a comprehensive review of his estate planning. Douglas opened a folder. That review is now complete. Craig leaned forward slightly. And what does that mean for... I'll get there, Douglas said, in the tone that had clearly concluded many such interruptions over the years. He laid it out methodically. The new will, the living trust, the beneficiary designations on the retirement accounts, all redirected to the education endowment. The power of attorney held jointly by Douglas and George, not by Amanda or Craig. Each document placed on the table in turn, each a quiet door closing. Amanda had stopped looking at the papers halfway through. She was looking at me. I looked back. I'd been a principal for 32 years. I knew how to hold eye contact with someone who didn't want to be seen. When Douglas finished, Craig said, with remarkable steadiness, Walter, you've obviously made some decisions you feel strongly about. I want you to know that Amanda and I only have your best interests. The email, I said. He went very still. I nodded to Douglas, who slid a copy of Roy's printed screenshot across the table. The address on Abercorn Street, highlighted in yellow, the loan discussions, the timeline. Craig looked at it for a long time. His jaw tightened once, then settled. That was a contingency conversation, he said. Nothing was ever formalized. You proposed my house as collateral for a loan without my knowledge or consent, I said. To cover debts your company owes because you misrepresented a property's value to a lender. That's not a contingency conversation, Craig. That's a blueprint. The room was very quiet. Amanda said, in a voice I barely recognized, Dad, let me finish, I said, not unkindly, but firmly, in the same voice I'd used for 32 years when a conversation needed to go somewhere real. I have been watching the two of you manage me for 14 months, positioning, planning, waiting for a medical event that would give you the leverage you needed. I paused. What happened in that hospital wasn't a tragedy to Craig. It was an opening. Amanda's eyes were wet. I didn't let it move me. Not yet. There would be time later to grieve the gap between the daughter I'd raised and the woman across this table. This wasn't the moment for that. The will stands, I said. The trust stands. The power of attorney stands. If you retain an attorney to challenge any of it, Douglas will tell you what that process looks like and what it will cost. And I think you'll find it a very poor use of resources you currently don't have. I looked at Craig, particularly given the civil judgments your company is carrying. Craig's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, not the way it does in movies, but in the small, deflating way of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. His shoulders dropped slightly. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, slipped into his lap. He looked at the document in front of him, not at me. Amanda said, How long have you known? Long enough, I said. I hired Roy Cates 3 weeks before the stroke, not because I wanted to find what I found, because 32 years of working with people teaches you to pay attention when something feels wrong. And something had felt wrong for a long time. We weren't going to steal from you, she said. Her voice was tight, thin. You were going to sell my house, I said. The house your mother picked out, the house where you grew up. You were going to liquidate it to cover your husband's bad deals, and you were going to manage me out of my own life to do it. I let that sit for a moment. What would you call that? She had no answer for that. Craig had no answer for that. Douglas had the answers he needed already, and he was writing something quietly at the corner of his desk. I stood up, slowly, steadying myself with one hand on the chair arm. My right side was still not at full strength, but I was standing, and I was clear, and I was done. "Amanda," I said. She looked up. "I spent 32 years telling students that how you behave when no one is watching tells the whole story. You spent 14 months behaving as though I wasn't watching." I was. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "Douglas will be in touch about any legal matters going forward. I'd like you to direct all future communication through him for now." I shook Douglas's hand. I nodded, once, at Craig. "The way you acknowledge a problem you've solved." I walked out. The November air on Bull Street was cold enough to see my breath. Forsyth Park was half a block away, the fountain running, a few people crossing through the fallen leaves. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and just let the city be what it had always been mine, and ordinary, and entirely real. Douglas called that evening. "Craig retained Marcus Stull," he said. "He's a sharp attorney, expensive." "Good," I said. "He called my office this afternoon." A pause. He got about 4 minutes into his inquiry before going very quiet. I told him the trust was waterproof and the will was clean, and that his client's best legal outcome was accepting the situation and saving the retainer. Another pause. He asked me to repeat that number. I told him the retainer alone would likely exceed what any challenge could realistically recover. "What did he say?" "He said he'd get back to me," Douglas said. "He hasn't." Over the following week, I heard nothing from Amanda or Craig. Not a call, not a text. George told me he'd seen Craig's car parked on Abercorn Street twice, once on Wednesday evening and once on Thursday morning, sitting out front for 10, 15 minutes each time. Engine running, never getting out, just sitting. I didn't go to the window. There was nothing out there I needed to see. Roy filed his final surveillance report on Friday. Craig had reached out to 4 more attorneys. 2 declined to take the case when they heard the basics. One quoted a retainer of $6,000 and outlined a process that Roy estimated would take between 18 months and 3 years with no realistic prospect of success. The 4th suggested, gently, that Craig consider mediation instead. Amanda, according to Roy's social media monitoring, had not posted anything in 10 days. For someone whose Instagram had documented their life in near-daily installments for the past 4 years, the new house, the weekend trips, Craig's development projects framed as triumphs of vision and enterprise, the silence was conspicuous. Her followers had started leaving comments asking if she was all right. She wasn't all right. I understood that, even from a distance. I wasn't sure she'd ever really been all right, or whether I'd simply not seen clearly enough to notice when the shift had happened, when the daughter I'd raised had let Craig's ambitions slowly rewrite her sense of what was acceptable. I thought about that a lot, in those quiet November evenings, sitting in the front room where Carol and I had spent so many ordinary nights, the wood stove going, the oak trees outside going bare branch by bare branch as the season turned. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had done its work and moved on. What was left was something quieter, a kind of clear-eyed grief for what had been and wasn't now, mixed with something I hadn't expected to feel so soon, relief. The weight of months of half-noticing, of telling myself I was overreacting, of making excuses for behavior that didn't deserve excuses, that weight was simply gone. George came by on Saturday morning with coffee and stayed for 2 hours, the way old friends can when there's nothing particular to say and nothing particularly needs to be said. We talked about the football season, about his granddaughter who just started at Georgia Southern, about the neighborhood and the way it was changing, normal things, the things that make up a life. Sunday I went out to the wood shop. I pulled the tarp off the rocking chair and set it in the patch of afternoon light that came through the south window and just looked at it for a while. 8 months of evenings. Georgia pine, hand-fitted joints, the seat shaped until it sat the way I'd imagined it sitting. It was almost done, needed sanding on the back uprights, needed a few hours with linseed oil and a good cloth, needed the final fit check to make sure it didn't rock with any wobble. I picked up the spokeshave and went back to work. The chair was not a metaphor for my situation. It was just a chair I was making. But there is something that happens when you do careful work with your hands, when you focus on the grain of the wood and the angle of the blade and the particular resistance of a joint that needs another pass that quiets the peat. Parts of the mind that have been running too fast for too long. I worked for 3 hours, and when I set the spokeshave down and looked at what I had in front of me, I felt, for the first time since the hospital, completely like myself. A week later, Amanda called. I almost didn't answer, but I'd told myself I would, whenever she did, because whatever came next required her to take the first step. "Dad," she said. A long pause. "I don't know where to start." "Then start anywhere," I said. "I've got time." What followed was not a clean conversation. It was halting and painful and circled back on itself more than once. She cried. I didn't, but I listened the way I'd learned to listen, over 32 years of conversations that mattered without planning what to say next. Without managing the outcome, just taking in what was actually being said. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't fully understood what Craig had been planning until she'd seen the email with the house address highlighted. She said she should have called from the hospital. She said she knew that none of this changed what had happened. I told her she was right. It didn't change what had happened. I also told her that I was her father, and I had been for 41 years, and that wasn't a thing that got unwound in a conference room on Bull Street. But I also told her that rebuilding something required both people to pick up tools, and I would be watching what she chose to do with hers. She asked about Craig. I told her that was her decision to make, not mine. She was quiet for a while after that. We didn't resolve anything that day, but we started, which was something. I've learned, in 66 years, that most good things begin with a start and then require a very long time of quiet, steady work before they show their shape. Douglas called 2 days later to tell me that Craig's attorney had officially notified him that no legal challenge to the estate plan would be pursued. He's cutting his losses, Douglas said. Smart, under the circumstances. How much did that cost him? I asked. The 4 consultations? I'd estimate $12,000 to $15,000, all told. $12,000 to $15,000 that Craig Holloway didn't have, spent running his hands against a wall until he accepted it was solid. I found no particular satisfaction in that. The money was gone. It didn't come back to me. But there was something clarifying about it, the proof that consequences were real, that the architecture of what I'd built with Douglas had done exactly what it was designed to do. I thought about what I'd said to students at graduation every year for 3 decades. Integrity is the only currency that compounds over time. I'd believed it when I said it. I still believed it. And I'd spent the past 3 weeks living proof of it, not because I'd been righteous, but because I'd paid attention and acted clearly, and not let grief or love or the desire for a simpler story talk me out of what I could plainly see. The rocking chair was finished on a Thursday in late November, a week before Thanksgiving. I'd oiled it twice, let it cure, oiled it again. The pine had gone warm and amber in the light of the workshop lamp. I set it on the back porch and sat down in it for the first time, and it rocked with a long, clean, unhurried motion, and I sat there in the cold Georgia evening, listening to the bare oak trees and watching the last of the light go out of the sky. I had not decided yet what to do with Thanksgiving. Amanda had asked, tentatively, if she could come. Without Craig, I hadn't said yes or no. I was still deciding what version of forward was possible, and I wasn't prepared to rush that decision in either direction. What I knew was simpler than any of the things that had happened. I knew the house behind me was mine. I knew the chair beneath me was something I'd made with my own hands over the course of 8 months of ordinary evenings. I knew that Douglas Whitfield had built something legally airtight that protected everything Carol and I had built, and directed it toward something that deserved it, toward students who would walk across a stage one day and shake someone's hand and start their lives with just a little less. Weight against them. That was enough. More than enough, actually. Some losses don't get repaired. They get outlasted. Slowly, one careful day at a time. And some things, given enough patience and the right kind of attention, can be brought back to something close to what they were. Not identical, not unmarked, but solid and true and worth sitting in. I rocked slowly in the evening cold, listening to the city settle around me, and I let the day wind down.